Welcome. Thanks for being here tonight. My name's Andy Gustis, and I teach business ethics here. I've been here for 18 years. And we have this Business, Faith, and Common Good speaker series every fall where we have different people come in from across the country. Last week we had a guy come in from New Jersey. Tonight we have a friend of mine and a friend of ours. All the business ethics folks here know him well, Santiago Mejia. So Santiago comes from Fordham University. And last year there's a journal called the Business Ethics Quarterly where all the Business Ethics Journal articles a lot of them get published. It's one of the premier journals. And last year, of the 3 most downloaded journal articles, Santiago wrote 2 of them. So he's kind of a big deal in that small little group of business ethicists. So we're very happy to have him here. He's a great guy. And tonight he's going to be talking to us a little bit. Most of you, if you've taken business ethics or you know much about business in general, you know about stakeholder and stockholder theory and that whole debate. And Dr. Mejia has done a lot of work in that field. He's really an expert in that field, and so he's going to be talking to you some about that. He's also an expert in corporate law and a number of other issues. So we're very glad that you came to speak to us tonight. So thank you very much. Oh, I want one more housekeeping thing. There are going to be sign-up sheets that I'll pass around. You can sign in. We'll also have scans at the back by the door, so when you leave, you can also scan that. And if you want to do both, that's fine. If you just want to do one or the other, that's fine too. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Should I use this or turn it off? Good? Okay. Great. So I'm delighted to be here. I have never been to Omaha. I really like what I saw from the plane and the little bit I checked out here. And so my talk today is about corporate ownership and the common good. And I want to start by talking about, by the way, I had all kind of computer difficulties. You know the typical thing that the computer crashed and you know the screen doesn't turn on? Well, it happened to me yesterday. So I was like struggling to sort of like figure out how to, and I had to divide the talk into 2 different PDFs for reasons that I'm not going to get into. So I'm going to do the first part now and then I have to switch to another PDF. And I want to start the talk by talking about a philosopher called Anthony Appiah. And I really like the story because I don't know if this is a true story or not. He didn't tell it to me. Somebody told it to me. That oftentimes he would fly in planes, and he was sitting in a plane that inevitably, you know, the person next door would ask him, sort of in the seat next would ask him like, so what do you do, sir? And then he would say, well, with some reluctance, because that never leads to a good conversation. So like, well, I'm a philosopher. And then of course, the usual answer was always, interesting, and what is your philosophy? And he always tried different kind of responses. All of them led to really bad places, until he found one that he thought was actually very good, which is, my philosophy is that everything is more complicated than you think. And I want to kind of like, you know, this is like the leitmotif of today's talk. So, who owns the corporation? And that's what the topic about today, or today's topic is about. Who owns the corporation? And I think most of you think shareholders. And the reasons are probably obvious. Why? First of all, shareholders get the dividends, or to be more precise, they get the residual earnings. And second, they vote for directors, they vote for the stuff they want, they have meetings where they decide how they want the corporation to be governed. But as I just said, things are more complicated than what you thought. Now, why think that shareholders are not owners? I mean, they do have the right to vote for directors, supposed right? And the reason is that those supposed rights, the rights to get the residual earnings and the right to appoint directors and vote for things, are very, very limited. In a way that seems suspicious to think that they're actually owners. So I'm going to focus on Delaware law, which happens to be a jurisdiction that is super important. Most of the Fortune 500 companies are incorporated there. And also, it is one of the least shareholder-centric. It's actually what you would call a board-centric jurisdiction. Boards have a lot of power and shareholders don't have that much. And I think to show that shareholders are not owners, this might be the best kind of like case for that. So in most jurisdictions, and Delaware in particular, corporate law seems intentionally designed to weaken the shareholders' ability to exert control of the corporation. And I'll explain a little bit why. So Bainbridge, a really famous corporate lawyer, has said, shareholders' control rights are so weak that they scarcely qualify as part of corporate governance. Another famous corporate scholar wrote, the alleged control rights of shareholders are a mere ceremony designed to give a veneer of legitimacy to managerial power. But his view is like managerial power is kind of pretty much absolute and shareholders have very little power. Now, in public corporations, where dispersed shareholders don't usually find it worthwhile to actually get informed about the company and coordinate what to vote. I don't know how many of you have shares. I have some shares because I have a pension fund. I work in business ethics. I'm supposedly interested in what happens in my companies, and I really almost never read any of the statements. They're very long. So shareholders don't care about their companies, and it's perfectly reasonable for them to not to do that because they have, first of all, investments in many, many corporations, and they're not going to make any difference. Their vote is not going to matter at all. So, as a consequence, dispersed shareholders have almost no power to elect directors because you have a very tiny percentage of what you can vote, and whatever you vote is not going to make much difference. Now, some scholars have pointed out, Linstow and, what is her name? I'm so bad with names. Blair, what's her name?
Her first name? I don't know her first name.
I do know her first name, but I forgot it. In any case, the first author, Anne Linstow, wrote in a very famous paper that corporate directors are the ultimate decision-making body of the firm, are not subject to the direct control of shareholders. They're not directly answerable to direct supervision by anyone, including the firm's shareholders. So even if a firm's shareholders were to pass a unanimous agreement or resolution directing the board to, say, pursue some form of action, say declaring a dividend or firing a particular executive, the board has no legal obligation to comply. So if this was a shareholder meeting and I was the CEO and you all unanimously voted to have a bigger dividend, I could decide not to do it. Now, of course, you could, in next year's meeting, fire the board and get a new board, but shareholders have very little power, usually they don't do that. So, shareholders in public corporations have no right to select the company CEO, that's selected by the board. They cannot require the company to pay dividends, that's the decision of the board. They cannot stop directors from squandering revenues on employees' healthcare, charitable contributions, or executive jets. The board has a lot of power, and shareholders have very little power. Now, the voting procedures, the way that voting is set up, actually seems to be set up to further weaken shareholders' power to control. So, the board in most public corporations with dispersed shareholders is effectively self-nominating. Whenever a board member is leaving, the board gets together and decides who they want to come, and that's the only nominee for next year's vote. And therefore, shareholders have like one vote. One candidate, and usually that person, of course, gets voted. Now, if you think that the company is really being not mismanaged by the board, shareholders cannot call a special meeting. Only board members can call a special shareholders meeting. The shareholders have to wait until next year for the regular meeting, and they have to wait for the meeting to sort of like make any decisions about directors and to elect or try to remove directors. If they want to change directors, if the directors that the board suggests are not the ones that they like, they have to actually pay, and it's a very high amount of money, to get a different kind of like voting ballot and send it to every single shareholder, and make sure that those shareholders vote with their new ballot instead of the alternative ballot. So, do you know how it goes like with, how do you call that in the US when you're voting like when the candidate is like too late, and you can just write it? Writing candidate. It's like that, right? You need a lot of people to agree to write a candidate for that candidate to vote. This is a similar thing. So, in summary, just to sort of like make my case that shareholders are not the owners. Many corporate laws seem intentionally designed to weaken shareholders' control rights. The corporation is a separate legal entity that owns the corporate assets and contracts in its own name. It's not the shareholders that do it. The board election is predetermined by the old board. Directors are not subject to direct control or supervision by shareholders, and shareholders have no power to elect directors, or very little power to elect directors. Now, Alan Strudler, criticizing the idea that shareholders are the owners, wrote, shareholders' right to vote is a formality much like the right to vote for government leaders in North Korea. Now, you might wonder, well, if shareholders are not the owners, then who is the owner? Well, there's two main positions, right? The first one says that the corporation has no owners. It's unowned. And many prominent corporate law scholars have defended that view. And the idea is that if you think of a firm, it's a network of contracts. Like you have consumers and employees and suppliers and shareholders and investors and loans and people who borrow money. All of them sort of like establish networks with one another through the corporation. Now, once we accept the argument that a firm is not an entity by a network of contracts, then the organization decomposes into just groups. Investors, managers, creditors, employees, suppliers, who negotiate among themselves what each of them is going to get in return from their contribution to the project. No class of participants, specifically the shareholders, has any natural right to call themselves or view themselves as owners, they argue. None of them is supposed to be an owner. Shareholders are not the firm's owners, they are merely suppliers of equity capital. All they do is like supply equity capital. They are residual claimants who bring to the firm their special ability of risk bearing, which creditors, managers, and employees tend to lack. Now, shareholders are very good at sort of like putting money at risk, partly because they're diversified, and that's what they bring to the table. But other constituencies bring very important things to the table, like employees, their labor. Without employees, the company wouldn't succeed. Managers and entrepreneurs bring their ability to coordinate. Consumers bring the ability of the company to actually get profits and sell stuff. So shareholders are just one of many constituencies, and they have any particular priority. Now, the other alternative is, you might think, weirder or perhaps more attractive, and it's that the corporation is self-owned. Now, you might be thinking, what the fuck is self-owned? Oh, we're recording it, right? So, if you think about yourself and ask yourself, who owns you? Well, I think most of you would say, well, me, like nobody else. Well, the same thing with the corporation, and here's kind of why, right? According to the law, first of all the corporate assets belong to the corporation, not to shareholders. So, if I have shares, say, in Apple, that doesn't allow me to go into Apple headquarters and just go around as though I was the owner. I can't. I cannot go to the Apple store and select, tell the clerk to show the things in one way or the other. All the corporate assets belong to the corporation. None of them belong to shareholders, and shareholders don't have any rights on the assets. Now, corporations, like people, own themselves because, like people, I mean, at least that's what Stout argues, they're capable of holding property in their own names. So like we do, they can hold property in their own names. They can enter their own contracts, like we do, and they can commit their own torts, like we do. So they are persons, and persons own themselves. They're legal persons, and persons own themselves. So she argues that from a legal perspective, corporations, shareholders do not and cannot own corporations. Corporations are independent legal entities, independent persons, if you want, that own themselves just as human beings own themselves. So what is my view? Well, my view is that things are more complicated than you thought. My view is not, I think this is mistaken, that the corporation is unowned. We can talk about why in the Q&A. I also think the corporation is not owned by themselves. I think the corporation is owned by shareholders. But I first wanted to sort of like get there to sort of like first see why the view is kind of like weird once you think about all the different constraints or the sort of like features of corporate law and how corporations work that suggest that shareholders are not the owners. Now I have to switch slides, I think. Yes. You feel like, what is it, like switch and bait? Okay, let me. And here I'm going to do a little bit of philosophy, probably the only serious philosophy that I'm going to do. Jonathan will love this, or hate it probably. Will love hating it. So I'm going to argue that shareholders have the power to elect directors, but in something that Aristotle called second potentiality. Now that's like a mouthful, I'll explain that in a second. So shareholders do have control rights, formal control rights. They are effectively the ones who vote for directors and the ones who vote for resolutions. Now, it is undeniable, as I was arguing before, that dispersed shareholders, say shareholders of Apple, find it very difficult to exercise their rights to control the public corporation, right? Because there's so many, because they don't have the incentive to get informed, and because even if they get informed and everything, the vote makes very little difference. Now, because of that, partly the right of control should be considered a formal right. And I want, can you have this? No? Yeah. Formal right, right? But usually, scholars who defend that the shareholders don't own the corporation think that formal right just means a mere formality. And I don't think that's the case. And to see that, I think Aristotle's second potentiality is a helpful way to see why. So, I'm going to talk about the capacity to speak French, right? Now, if you think about a rock, there's no meaningful sense. Some people have tried. There's movies about it. Some people have, there's no meaningful sense in which a rock has the potential to speak, right? You can try and teach a rock to speak. I wish you luck. I don't think you'll succeed, ever. There's no way, right? Now, a young baby, a newborn, say Andy's son, they have a capacity to speak French, but only in first potentiality. Namely, that baby doesn't speak French. There's nothing you can do to make it speak French. But eventually that kid has the kid is the kind of creature that will be able to speak French. You can teach a kid French. You cannot teach a rock to speak French. And finally, think about an adult French speaker. That person can speak French. Now, imagine that that person is like depressed, or is apathetic, or is gagged. Then that person, you know, has the capacity to speak French in second potentiality. Like if I had the capacity to speak in English in a second, but I couldn't speak because I was gagged. But I had it, right, in a very different way than a young baby has it. Now, the adult, unlike the baby, could exercise her capacity to speak French in the here and now if she wants, and is not impeded. And that's why she has it in second potentiality. The baby doesn't yet have the capacity to do that, but she can develop it. And the rock will never be able to develop the capacity. Now, what I want to argue is that shareholders' ability to control the corporation is an instance of a second potentiality. Right? Like an apathetic French speaker who does not want to speak or doesn't find any interest in speaking, widely dispersed shareholders are apathetic to exercise their vote because their efforts are seldom worth. So that's a typo. Because whatever, you understood the point. Because it's seldom worth their effort, right? But the reason why widely dispersed shareholders have little control over the company is not that they lack the capacity to control it, but that they're not exercising the capacity. If they really want it, and sometimes shareholders really want to, they could coordinate and fire the board and get a new board. Now, by the way, a rock has no ability to control the corporation, but here's the interesting part. Other stakeholders, say consumers, or workers, or suppliers, have the right to control the company in first potentiality like the baby. Here's why. You could take a shareholder-owned company and transform it, sell it to the employees and make it a cooperative, which is employee-owned. In that case, the employees can become the owners. But they have it in first potentiality. They need that transition in order to be able to do that. Now, if shareholders, as I said before, really want or really need, they usually mobilize their efforts and exercise the control rights in the here and now. And here are two examples. ExxonMobil was not doing enough to sort of like take care of and sort of take seriously climate change and start sort of trying to sort of like move in the right direction. And then some shareholders just like coordinated to fire and not fire, but sort of nominate two board members that they wanted. Similarly, Danone was not doing very well, and shareholders forced the CEO, who was also the chairman, to quit. Now, here's the other thing that's peculiar. Like the fact that they have to show that they have control, that it's manifest in the fact that when they sell their shares to a controlling shareholder, say when Elon Musk bought Twitter, who had a lot of dispersed shareholders, then Elon Musk has a lot of significant control. Now, where did it come from if it was not already from the shareholders? It's the only thing that changed in Twitter. Now, one thing that I want to clarify is that shareholders as a whole have control rights, not individual shareholders. It's like the group of shareholders together that have control rights. Now, so now let me go back to all the things that I was saying to undermine my own view, and to sort of suggest that shareholders are not owners, and how to address them. By the way, the things is even worse for the shareholder ownership view. So, I've shown so far that shareholders have the right to control the company in second potentiality, but I still need to explain why so many of the corporate laws seem designed to weaken and interfere with this capacity, right? To undermine the alleged ownership of shareholders. Like, if you wanted shareholders to be owners, why make this second potentiality so difficult to exercise? You would imagine, no, it should be easy to exercise. And I think there's good reason for that. Reasons that have to do precisely with the interest of shareholders, although they're not obvious in the first instance. So, weakening shareholders' control rights, insofar as shareholders have less control, that facilitates decision making among shareholders. Because if most of the decisions are delegated, we are not going to fight as shareholders about our decisions because someone else is making the decisions for us. Also, and this is super important, it protects minority of shareholders from majority shareholders. If I have a lot of control as a majority shareholder, you are going to be less likely to invest. But if I have very little power as a controlling shareholder, then I'm going to be more likely to invest. And finally, the alleged weakening of shareholders' control rights responds to practical considerations that have to do with, like, laws that may sound good in theory but are undesirable, unfeasible, or unenforceable in practice, or vice versa. And finally, some of them obey to legitimate and sometimes illegitimate political considerations or path dependencies and the vagaries of the lawmaking process. Now, to make it short, I'm going to just focus on these two. I think I kind of already said a little bit about both of them. So, weakening the shareholders' control right facilitates decision making in the company in general. To manage a collective property requires active management and is owned by many individuals. You need a governance structure where much of the decision making is delegated to a small group of people. Like, if you're sharing a car with your brother, you can sort of coordinate. If you have a car that you have to share with 100 people, things start to become complicated, and you need somebody to sort of organize stuff. When you have millions of shareholders, you really need to delegate much of the decision making, and for shareholders not to be always getting their noses in. So that's a good reason why having just one shareholder meeting a year is good, and only very few decisions are taken by shareholders. Otherwise, it's going to interfere with the ability of boards and CEOs to execute the decisions. And this fact alone, I think, explains significantly, or goes a long way to explain why the rights of control of shareholders are limited and why they delegate so much of the administration to the board, right? So the board, remember that the scholars who argue that the corporation owns itself depend partly on the fact that the corporation has independent legal personhood, right? They are like an independent is the company that contracts, is the contract that owns the corporation. Now, that facilitates enormously contractual relationships. It's much easier to make a contract with one entity, the corporation, than with all the shareholders, right? You have to sign, just imagine how many contracts you have to sign. Now, if the corporation is the owner of all the assets, that ensures that all the assets that are there are going to be held by the corporation, and the shareholders cannot say, oh, you know what, I want some of my shares, I want some of my, I want an iPad, I want whatever. Because then the executives managing the company won't have enough assurances of how much they have and what property they have. That ensures the long-term continuity and stability of the firm. And finally, if the corporation is owner of all the assets, that also shields the property of the corporation from personal creditors of the shareholders. So if, say, you have a big debt and they want to come after you, they cannot come after your company because precisely there's this sort of shield between you and the company. And that's important why the company has to be like a legal and independent person. Not that you have debts in your life, you were just like close to me. Now, shareholders as a whole are the ultimate owners of these assets, and they actually can reclaim them if they really want it. But they have to get all together and get the board to liquidate the company. When that happens, they liquidate the company, everyone is paid, and whatever is left, you can distribute it to shareholders. Most shareholders don't want to do that for good reasons, but if they really want their assets, they actually can reclaim them. It's just that you cannot just do it like on a whim, or like it's not easy to do it. So I've explained why shareholders need to delegate most control, actually owners in general, but owners and shareholders in particular, to the board and structure the collective ownership as an independent legal entity. And this explains why corporate law facilitates separating ownership and control. But it does not explain why corporate law seeks to increase, rather than decrease, the agency cost between shareholders and board. Why make it particularly difficult for shareholders to actually have boards accountable? And as I was suggesting before, part of the rationale has to do with that if you weaken shareholders' control, that protects minority shareholders and that promotes more investment. And if you want a corporate system like the US that has a lot of public investment, you want to protect minority as much as possible and to incentivize their investment. So corporate law seeks to address three agency problems. The first, that is the most well-known, everybody kind of like is what most finance professors talk about, is the conflict between managers and shareholders. And if you think that shareholders should be the owners, you should give a lot more power to them than what they currently have. But corporate law is also has to do with conflict between controlling and non-controlling shareholders. And finally, conflict between shareholders and the corporation's contractual counterparties. Now, it is precisely because of that, I think, that explains why some shareholder rights are weakened further than you would expect, and not the conflict. The sort of agency costs are not the only consideration. So, if they weaken the power, as I said before, and strengthen the power of the delegates, that reduces the need to monitor other owners. So if shareholders have a lot of control, you have to be, imagine you were only 3 shareholders, right? And you had a lot of control, each of you. You would have to be sort of like very careful that this shareholder is not going to like start, influencing the board. But if you have like this long distance between shareholders and the delegates, you don't have to be sort of like all the time paying attention to shareholders. And because you want public corporation with a lot of shareholders, you don't want them sort of to be concerned. And therefore you want delegation. It also protects owners from the opportunistic behavior of other owners. That's part of what you would be sort of like trying to sort of like oversee and monitoring. And minority shareholders who might be afraid of like tendencies of majority shareholders to kind of take advantage of their majority position are more likely to invest if they know that such majorities have weak powers. Of course, if you have a majority of more than 50%, then they're kind of screwed. But if you have like 20, 30% participation of shareholders, minority shareholders are much more willing to invest because they have less power. So weakening their power is valuable for shareholders to delegate decision making and attract investors worried about decision opportunistic tendencies. And as I said, there's other features to corporate law that I didn't talk about today that can be explained by appealing to practical considerations about design and enforcement of laws, political power dynamics, path dependencies, and other things. All right. You might think that now I established that shareholders are owners. But again, things are more complicated than you think. Because I have actually not established that they have ownership rights. So imagine that I've convinced you that shareholder ownership can explain the challenges of corporate law, right? Let's imagine that you have done that, right? But I've used ownership rights throughout the talk. And I don't think I'm entitled to that. Because all that they have is, I've shown that they have certain powers, right? But not certain rights. Now, you might think that shareholders have these powers but not these rights. Now, Blair and Stott, again, the scholars who defend the corporation on itself view, argue the following, which is, we give these powers, we give certain powers to shareholders because this benefits all stakeholders, right? But shareholders should use these powers not to look after their own interest. Shareholders should use their powers to pursue the interests of corporation stakeholders. And therefore, they have a power that the power should be used to serve others. Now, you might be thinking, that's kind of naive. They wouldn't do that. And it's kind of true. But even though it's true, that criticism is unpersuasive in the context of the kind of examination I'm doing, which is like, how should we think of shareholders, right? First of all, many demands within moral philosophy are similarly naive. Like, there's tons of things that we demand of people that are kind of naive, like people shouldn't ever lie or seldom lie, and it's kind of, well, typically do it. The fact that some of the demands are very high doesn't mean that they lose their normative force. And second, there are many instances in corporations where people have ownership powers that they use to pursue the rights of others. You might be thinking, which ones? NGOs, non-profits. Non-profits are corporations, are set up, have independent personhood, have property, they can establish contracts, and have a board. Now the board is not appointed by shareholders, it's self-appointed, and their power is not as constrained by different constituency, and nevertheless, they use this power not to serve them, or at least in general, but to benefit other parties, whoever the non-profit is serving. So you might think that the powers do not entail the rights. So why think that shareholders have the right to be called owners, instead of just a power to have certain control that they should use wisely? And I think there's two reasons. First of all, because they agree to participate in the firm in exchange for these rights. And second, because these rights are recognized by all those who contracted with the firm. Let me elaborate this kind of quickly. Shall I wrap it up quickly and skip something? Okay.
As you want, as you wish.
I don't know. How many questions do you want to ask? Or like, few or many? So let me try to go through this quickly. So how does a company get formed? Usually there's a founder, an entrepreneur has an idea, and they can organize the company however fuck they want. Really. They can organize as a non-profit, some of them do. They can decide to make it like a consumer-owned. Anyone knows a consumer-owned company? You know it, but do you recognize it? REI? It's owned by the consumers. You know, you become a member and you pay that's it's a co-op. Or a worker cooperative, or a producer cooperative. Or, as most of them do, an investor-owned cooperative, like a shareholder-owned cooperative. Now, why do they organize it in this way? Well, usually because that's the most profitable way to do it, and they want money. But also because this, in many cases, is the best way to guarantee the success of the enterprise. Like, capital is critical, and it's very difficult to get, especially at the beginning. And it's hard to get in good terms without corresponding ownership rights. So, in exchange for capital, they recognize that the best thing that they can do is give shareholders that are giving them the capital some rights, not just powers, but actually rights to pursue their own interests, to make sure that the company is used or is managed in a way that benefits them in exchange for their investment. So they come together, they negotiate, and they decide, that the shareholder is going to be have shares, and the shares have certain rights. So all these parties who create the firm agree that shareholders have ownership rights, not just powers. And these rights allow shareholders to make sure that their assets are being pursued in their own interest. Now, I'm going to skip this part. It's kind of technical. Now, moreover, it's not just the people who coordinate to sort of get the company started, right? Most scholars who defend that corporations are not owned by shareholders recognize that most people think that that's the dominant view. That is widely held by the public, by investors, by managers, by employees. And this matters because it means that all these stakeholders, all these employees, all these consumers, all these employees know when they're contracting with the firm, when they're buying from the firm or working for the firm, that the shareholders are its owners. I'm going to skip this too. It's kind of technical. I can go into that if you want. Now, there's other reasons to think that shareholders should be owners. One is the liability, limited liability. Limited liability seems to be protecting owners, and shareholders are precisely the ones that are being protected. And shareholders have other rights that are very peculiar if they weren't the owners. Shareholders are the only ones that can get the corporation to sue derivatively, and they are the only ones who can actually ask the corporation to inspect the corporate books. Shareholders can require to inspect the corporate books. No, if you're an employee, you cannot go to the CEO and say, "Hey, I want to check the books." No, you cannot. You have to buy some shares to do that. And also in corporate law, usually it's recognized that they're owners. So what? And also, wasn't this about the common good too? I mean, the common good is like small, but we can talk more about it. Now, why do I care about thinking that shareholders are the owners? First of all, because this is the correct view, and all my fucking field says the opposite, and it just drives me crazy. Really. I mean, Jonathan can attest to that. Not that I go crazy, but that this is like the correct view, and everybody in business, I think that's the wrong view. Now, it is the view that recognizes that shareholders have a certain primacy on the corporation, and that sort of like helps managers think of the obligation by thinking about what's in the interest of shareholders. I'm going to skip this too. Now here's the fear, and what you may be thinking, well, so everything should be done in service of shareholders? And I think in some ways, yes. If they're the owners, they can do whatever they want with the corporation. That's the fear, right? And that's the reason why I think many people in business ethics think they shouldn't be owners. That if you think they're owners, you can do whatever you want. Like, I can do whatever they want with my cell phone. I can throw it away, I can give it, I can break it in two, I can do all kinds of stuff. And therefore, you think that they are the owners, they can do whatever they want. Now, I don't think that follows. Private ownership is and should be regulated by the state, right? And if you think about different things that you own, I can do whatever they want with my phone. I mean, not whatever they want, but a lot of things. But if you think about real estate, for instance, there's a lot of constraints in what I can do with real estate. Now, because of that, because ownership should be regulated by the state, it should be regulated so that the corporation's activities promote, or at the very least not undermine, but I think promote the common good. So shareholders have the right to own the corporation and to have it managed in their interest, but provided that it actually promotes the common good. Of course, it can be there's different ways of promoting the common good, and some of them might be more amenable to shareholders, and that's fine. As I said before, we impose all kind of limits on real estate, for instance. Like in most places that you buy a house, you cannot decide to sort of start a factory there, or you cannot decide to sort of have a shop. Also, you are forced to sort of like clean some stuff for the neighbors, etc. Because of the significance, importance, and impact that corporations have on our socioeconomic landscape, I think we should impose and recognize a variety of restrictions on shareholders to ensure that they actually are managing the corporation and getting the corporation managed in the interest of society, in the interest of the common good. Thank you.
Questions for Dr. Mejia?
I mean, before you ask questions, like, here's the thing that I hope is like, yeah, shareholders are owners, but it's so much more complicated, and I think interesting. Now questions, if you have any.
Why do you think that weakening the powers helps the minority shareholders to be protected from the majority, but not the other way around? This is an example, it's not shareholder exactly, but when our president first came here to the university, he had open meetings with all the faculty and staff. You could come and talk to him and then he would listen. He didn't do everything he said, but he listened. And there was one guy at one of these, he's known to be a little bit of a, he's a faculty member, but he's a little bit of a kook in some ways. But he said, what I would suggest is, because now we have faculty senates, and certain people are elected,
Yeah.
small group, like the board
Yeah.
in a company. He said, what we should do is we should have a university-wide faculty senate where all of the faculty members are on this senate. So you would have 800 faculty meeting one Friday a month to make all the decisions. We would spend all day making these decisions. And the dean of the dental school was there, and he raised his hand. He said, I can assure you none of the dental faculty want to do this. He said, how can you speak for all the dental faculty said, well, for one thing, you want to do it on Fridays. Today is Friday. The reason I'm here representing all of them is because they're actually working, doing clinicals over at the clinic. And so they couldn't go to any of the meetings. So I know they wouldn't want to do it. And so, but someone like that, we want to protect the Senate from having someone like that have a voice in some ways. Because he would just take all day with his crazy ideas that he would bring up all the time.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which you're protecting the majority from the minority as well. Not just the minority from the majority. So why did you put it just to be the minority from the majority?
So I agree with you entirely that we have to find ways to protect all shareholders from one another. And if you give too much power to a minority, it can actually be used against the majority. So for instance, in some, usually small startups, some minority shareholders have veto powers. And a veto power can be very toxic because it entails that unless the particular shareholder agrees with the decision being made, it won't allow anything to pass. And that can be very damaging, right? So you have to also think about how can you sort of like make sure that it's all an issue of balance between different sort of like agency costs and agency relationships, right? Now, it's interesting that Delaware is one of the most board-centric jurisdictions, and correspondingly, I think it's not an accident. It's one of the countries that has the most, or one of the biggest public markets, right? In, for instance, Brazil or Colombia, the shareholders have a lot more power than they have in Delaware, right? For instance, I don't know if I think it's Brazil. If shareholders unanimously want something, it has to be done. They can override the board. In Brazil, shareholders can call an extraordinary meeting anytime, right? In Delaware, they can't. But that means that, or it turns out that that corresponds to a corporate setting where a lot of the companies are owned by controlling shareholders, right? They're owned by families or by controlling shareholders. So it seems that there's a certain correlation of like how you tweak the law might incentivize more or less of certain kind of shareholders. And if you want more minority shareholders, if you want more public investors, you might want to weaken the majority investors' power in order to attract them, right? Of course, if you weaken it too much, if you give minority shareholders veto, then no controlling shareholder will want to ever open it up to the public, right? But for instance, in Delaware, there's no veto for minority shareholders. I don't know if that helps.
I think it helps, but why is it not also that you want to weaken the power so that the minority doesn't have so much power over the majority?
I mean, in general, the minority has very little power over the majority. In general, that's the case because they vote. Usually it's majority. I mean, majority voting, and when it's majority voting, whoever has the votes wins, and the minority, by definition, is going to lose. So the minority in general loses. In any corporate vote, they're going to lose. And therefore, if you weaken the power of the majority, that difference in the voting difference is not going to be as significant.
So it might be a small factor, but if you had this guy and he could call a meeting anytime, even as a minority,
yeah,
that'd be a big problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which I think is one of the reasons why in Delaware they can't.
And at the annual meeting, he can cause a problem, but he can only do it once a year.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how Delaware is set up. I mean, if the board thinks, this guy can talk to the board members and see if they can convince them. And if the board thinks it's warranted, they can call a meeting. But it has to go through them. And that ensures that, also because, again, if you can call a meeting, then all the other shareholders have also to be sort of like attentive to what's happening. And you don't want that. You want them to be just like removed and free and just go and live your life and, go do dental work or whatever you want to do on a Friday. Other questions?
I have one question. At the very end of your presentation, you said we need to somehow keep the stockholders or shareholders accountable.
Yeah.
They would somehow serve the common good, but they are not liable for anything. Are they? They are not liable for the how would you keep them responsible? I guess that's my question. How would society keep the shareholders responsible to serve the common good somehow, or to do things
Great. That's a great question. So the way that corporate law is designed so that boards have a lot of power, right? And shareholders have very little. And it's designed partly to ensure that, you know, they who are in the know about what's happening in the corporation make decisions that are sort of like in the interest of the corporation, but also in the public good, right? Now, as you said, shareholders are liable for almost nothing, and even money-wise, if the corporation goes bankrupt, they lose their investment, but that's it, right? The corporation cannot, nobody else can sort of go after any of the other income. Now, I think recognizing why corporate law is designed the way that it is, and recognizing that shareholders are meant to have very little power, entails that this argument that, oh, we have to do this really toxic thing because that's what's best for shareholders, is like misinterpreting what the power that is given to the board is, right? They have to sort of like, shareholders should be limited by boards themselves about what is legitimate for shareholders to demand and request, right? Part of what it entails to give power to boards is also give moral power to boards to make decisions on behalf of shareholders. And I think, unfortunately, not recognizing that the ownership that shareholders have over the corporation is peculiar and has this sort of like removal dimension entails that a lot of the decisions are delegated to boards, including moral decisions. But the way that oftentimes this is cashed out is like, well, the board is responsible for making money for shareholders no matter what. And that's, I think, what's problematic, right? I don't think that the solution is to sort of like make shareholders more morally accountable. I think it's recognizing that shareholders should want the board to be morally accountable and kind of like offset or like delegate that to boards. And recognize that part of what the board is doing is like making sure that the company is promoting the common good.